Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious Tea. My guest in the studio today is James Parker. Hi, James.
Hello.
And James is an international policy advisor on energy and climate change. And in today's interview, we're going to be exploring climate change, really where we are at this point with that as an issue, how that relates to consciousness awakening one's inner path, and a little bit about what we can hopefully do to tackle some of these issues. So, James, maybe a good starting point, I think, would be that it seems to me that the perception we can have is that there are still questions around whether climate change is or isn't happening, whether it's a man-made thing, whether it's something that's happened many times in there's these misconceptions. What's your perspective on that?
Well, we're living in very different times now. We're living in a time of incredible change, and it's becoming clear that climate change is now simply the case. If you look at, say, what the IPCC report says, which is a very conservative perspective of the UN, says we need to change things at a grand scale. We haven't got slow transition. We have to change things at a grand scale. And people like Michael Mann, who is a climate change scientist, he clearly says it's even more extreme than that. So it's getting to a point where climate change is the same as smoking, that smoking causes cancer. It's becoming a universal position now, and there's still obviously denial out there. But from a simple perspective, not from a complex science perspective, but from a simple perspective, which is fact one, CO2s do trap heat in the atmosphere. That's a fact. Fact number two is that human beings are pulling an enormous level of CO2s into the atmosphere. So if you look at those two facts, you put them together, it's so simple. Fact three is that clearly human beings are causing climate change. So we know now that it is the case from both a scientific perspective and from a direct observation, say the kind of people like Krishnamurti, what they speak about. So yes, now it's just the case, and we need to really deal with it seriously.
Yeah. And, it seems also that a lot of people may even kind of get it, like they kind of recognise this is a serious thing. And yet in their life, it's like there's a disengagement. There's a kind of little bit of a sense like, we all know we're going to die at some point. Individually, we're physically going to die at some point. And yet it's very easy to live our life in denial that's ever going to happen. And then someone's given 6 months to live and suddenly they come alive and they start to live their life. And it strikes me that a lot of people's attitude to climate change can be, oh yeah, that's going to happen. It's quite serious, but then we just kind of blank it out. Is that something you see? And if so, why do you think people do that?
Well, if this goes to the psychological perspective, it's a security blanket. And the reason we have this idea that we need to deal with this situation in the future, it's like the government have a plan that by 2050 we need to cut X amount of emissions, 15%, 20%. But they're ignoring a factor. And the factor is that the CO2s are going into the atmosphere at an exponential level and are accelerating. So emission trading, emission reductions, and the conceptual governmental structure and the legal structure really is now delusional and not looking at the reality. So people see that and then they switch off.
Yes.
So that because they can see that nothing's happening. So that's the first fact. And secondly, it's a denial then because it's a very scary situation. So people are very much more focused on their personal situation, helping people personally in the world, helping the environment personally, but also consumed with what's happening, within their mortgage, their financial situation, and what's happening with the economy, So we're absorbed in from that perspective
Yes.
for survival, for our own personal survival.
And is that something you see at a governmental? Because I know you also advise governments on this.
Mm.
Is it the same thing that they're focused on the next few years, getting re-elected, dealing with the things that society sees as urgent, as opposed to? I mean, how do they? When you present them with the facts, what's the response to that?
Well, what you have a situation where people think that the government is somehow sitting on top of a cliff somewhere, pulling, metaphorically speaking, pulling levers and in control of everything. No, the government is just as part of humanity and on the earth like everybody else, and they are locked within a situation like ordinary people are locked in a situation, locked in an economic structure which is now global. So they have to compromise at an enormous level and focus on that in order to keep the national economy together, because nation states are competing against one another for economic control, and so businesses may take their money elsewhere. So they have to focus on that.
And of course, if a government came out and said, we've got this very, very serious issue, and in 30 years' time or 50 years' time, this is the impact. People don't want to hear it. They just focus on a new government. Yeah. It's a kind of crazy kind of thing in a sense.
It is. It's a situation now where the denial is becoming really significant. And that is part of the problem, that if you look at, say, the United Nations, they really should be the ones implementing through international regulation collectively. They should now be doing it almost like an emergency level, like another world war. But the problem that we have is that structure is an old structure. The current structure is an old structure. Yes. So what we really need now is we need a level of unification. Yes. Where those people at the cutting edge of thinking, these people who are setting up their own projects in different areas across the world, need to begin to unify and sing the same hymn sheet, which is that we need now international humanitarian organisation, which is what One People, One World conference is all about in October, and also what SIMPOL, International Simultaneous Policy, are doing, which is this idea that we can basically unify globally these people at the cutting edge, the wisest people.
And I want to come back to that more in a little bit. But before we do that, I'm also particularly interested that it's not just society as a whole that kind of tunes out. What particularly is interesting is people that are on a path of, a spiritual path, or, a path of kind of, their own inner kind of development, who on one level are that much more open and that much more attuned and conscious. Even that, which is, I know kind of globally is a small minority of people, but that group of people, even there seems to be a kind of disengagement from it. It's like the attitude can be, if I sit here and do my own meditation practice and my own yoga practice, and I practice loving, compassionate kind of thoughts, that if I clean up this bit here, that's what I need to do to help clean up the planet. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is relatively the case. All things like that have the place. So when people's inner perspective changes, then obviously their effect on society changes. However, it's always happening, and this is one thing that is ignored. It's always happening within a global structure that is based on ignorance, which is based on non-separation, which is based on competition. Now, and an ideological conceptualized reality. Now, if you look at, say, like people like Krishnamurti, when they said observe the actuality, observe the problem, you clearly see that system cannot solve the growing crisis that we face. And we all live on one planet, we're all part of the universe, and when you actually are aware of that, you can then switch off from the system, because you can see the system as an old school ignorant perspective. Yes. But the reality is we live within that. So our very functioning is still within that. So it needs to be both. That is totally the case. We need to evolve internally, because the mind affects reality and reality affects the mind. It's one whole process, totally unified. But that then has to also change the external situation, where we have a reform of the United Nations, like an international humanitarian organisation, that has authority at a humanitarian, but at a human perspective, not nation state perspective, that contains capitalism and the competitive nature of that within a structure that says you can no longer sell weapons, you can no longer, destroy the environment. And then when you do that, you basically then contain it with a level of wisdom,
yes,
and intelligence at a high level of consciousness. Now, the people who are very much focused on the spiritual side switch off to that as well, because they only know the old system.
yes.
But if you'd imagine people like...
And there's a sense they feel they've transcended that system. They've
Yeah.
kind of gone beyond that system, therefore the system is now defunct and irrelevant.
Yes, and internally they have. But externally they haven't.
Yes.
Still got to pay mortgages, still got to
Sure.
do all
Sure.
those things. But if you could imagine a situation where, like the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Einstein, Robert Kennedy, they, had a humanitarian focus, which they did do, but, implemented policies internationally through the UN, then you would solve it. Now, what we really need to happen is that in truth now, lots of people are at that level of consciousness. At those times they weren't. But now, we're living in a time where there's a significant number of intelligent, wise people who have switched off from the old system. But what really needs to happen is that those people doing their individual projects, kind of what in Dynamics, they call it yellow, they're doing their individual project. What really is they need to begin to unify together
Yes.
in one whole. Kind of what Paul Hawkins said when he talked about the movement with no name. It's got to be a kind of like that, but with authority that goes above and beyond
Yes.
the structure that the old, non-workable structure
Yes.
that we have today.
But of course, part of what that then requires is collaboration on a scale that we've in some ways never seen before.
Yes, it does.
And people that have different worldviews sometimes, different political views, different ideologies, actually collaborating and working together. And it's interesting, you used the example a little bit earlier, kind of a world war. And it's really interesting, you look back at something like the First World War and the Second World War, a whole, clusters of nations working together and collaborating in a way that's true. You haven't seen that in a sense since. And there's something about a crisis that certainly drives that kind of collaboration. Or, shared goals are always very interesting. It always fascinates me how, we're filming this at the time of the World Cup, which maybe dates me when it comes out. But anyway, it's interesting that, you have, in the UK, your Arsenal fans and your Man United fans and your Spurs fans, whatever. And, through, most of the year, they hate each other and they fight each other. And then England are playing someone else. And suddenly they're all friends and they're all together. And it's that thing around having a shared focus and a shared kind of enemy or thing. The trouble is, it seems to me, that with climate change, is the danger is by the time we recognise on a global scale the severity, it's potentially too late. Is that a real
Well, it is a potential, but we have two sides of the coin on this. The first side of the coin is that clearly, if we stay as we are, and we keep trying to protest or petition the governments because they are stuck, they're equally as stuck,
Yes.
like it's a brick wall, and then things like Occupy movement happens where there's a fight and a protest against it. It's not going to work. What really is going to happen, it's going to be more like Live Aid, which was brilliant at the time, which was about giving money to Africa. But now we need a situation where people unify across the whole world, which then gets like celebrities on board and people like Stephen Hawkins, etc., on board. And then when you have that, it is like Live Aid, but instead it's now the UN needs to reform into a humanitarian perspective, and then which is also linked into the national democracy and all that, which is what Simple's about, and One People, One World, very much about that. So when you have that, then we can make real change. Now, from that awareness, you see that we cannot, it just is not possible to use the current system. So the crisis is so urgent. It's not just a little bit urgent, it's incredibly urgent for this change. And most people predict that the kind of thing I'm saying is going to happen in the future, so far away in the future.
I think people see it as something that's at least several hundred years away. And I think in their mind, they like to think enough generations that they won't, 500, 1,000 years away. And, as I understand it, we're talking about something that's decades, not centuries, not...
Well, I would say, yes, it is decades, but I would say that, it's a cause and effect process, which is happening non-linear, is that the reason we project so far into the future is that we're in like a linear human-centered time frame where the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But we're moving beyond that now. We live in a time where it's non-linear, where cause and effect, it's a situation where we can share ideas. We've got global communication. Cultures are interacting globally. So the collective consciousness is moving into a global perspective, whether that's unconscious with people. But that is still enormously changing the way people are seeing reality, the way people are interacting, which is why the people are getting more and more cynical with the old system, because they're looking at it and they're unconsciously seeing it as something that is not the case now, which is not needed now. So people do switch off because of that. So what needs to happen now is very clear. We need a unification process with these organisations that truly care, have the wisdom to see that the current structure, which is also the old structure really, is not going to do it. So that is the process.
And on an organisational or national level, that makes sense. What can the individual do? If someone who's watching this that feels kind of affected by what we're saying, it kind of recognises the severity of this, but doesn't have a key role in an NGO or a political role or whatever. What can they do to support this unification that you're talking about?
Well, that's a good point. Now, what they're doing already is keep doing that. And if they're meditating, if they've set up an organic, small farm, something like that, that clearly everything helps and that is needed. So continue doing that. But at the same time, the problem is it's always negated by the global economic structure.
Yes.
So it's always going to be very limited. So I would say, we all live on the planet. We all breathe the same air. We all receive the same sunlight. So I would say instead of just focus on groups, what we really need to do is recognise that we are humanity, which is just generally the case, and we become part of this unification movement where we begin to see beyond our own, belief systems,
yes,
our own ideology. And it's an intuitive thing where we actually want to truly help the world beyond our own belief systems.
Yes.
And then that is a case where we actually link up. So if you're doing a great project somewhere and actually begin to link up, and in many ways, if you want to use spiral dynamics, this is yellow to turquoise, because yellow is very much individual groups doing their, very, very, wise, intelligent things. But it needs now to go above and beyond the current structure or the old structure and develop a new emergence, a new intelligent global structure that then begins to filter down and change the old.
Yes, and of course, as you say, the individual continuing with their practices and their own path of development, that facilitates that individual growth. Is there a value in people doing things like, sharing useful content on social media or donating to organisations? If so, which organisations? Do you see those kind of forms of kind of micro activism as a useful thing or not?
Yes, I do. It is very important, and that needs to continue exactly how it is. But there's another side to it, and the other side is that it's kind of like begging. It's still within a system where we have almost an economic barrier that makes these different groups, charities, NGOs, begging for money within the system. Yes. But they're stuck, you see. Now, a new movement would be going back to like what Live Aid did, where it's saying, no, enough is enough. If humanity really wants to survive as a species, it's got to get to a point where it no longer is like this, fighting against the system. It becomes a collective movement where it becomes so obvious. Yes. It becomes so like you just cannot ignore it anymore. And so it does that, and it puts a lid on activity that is going to damage the earth.
Yes.
And things like selling weapons and those things. So it puts a limit on it, and it still allows it to function.
Yes. I mean,
but within an ethical perspective.
Yes, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but just one of the things that also just comes into my mind is that I think what feels so frustrating about the situation is that the technology exists. As I understand it, the technology exists for alternative forms of power and ways of doing things. The will doesn't seem to be there enough, and it seems to me if the will was enough, we could change it. We could deal with this, as I understand it.
Yes, and this is going back to the governments. Now, it's not like the governments sit there and say we're not going to do this.
Yes.
It's a situation where the amount of investment in fossil fuel consumption, and people think it's just cars putting pollution in the atmosphere. No, the whole industrialised process of factories, of packaging, the whole thing.
Cows farting.
Yeah, that's one as well.
It makes me smile that way.
That as well. And so the whole thing, the whole structure is based on an unsustainable perspective. Now, but it can be changed, but it's not going to happen through a slow transition.
Yes.
It's going to happen through a revolution that is not like the old idea of a revolution. It is an internal psychological revolution and an external active revolution. But it can only happen when it goes above and beyond the old separative structure, because ultimately, if you look at, say, consciousness, it is based on ignorance. It's based on the idea that we are separate from each other, that we are separate from the earth. And this is not some hippie New Age thing. It's just the case. It's just like what Krishnamurti spoke about, is that we are not separate. The truth is we are all interconnected, unified. We're on the planet and also the universe as just a scientific fact and a spiritual fact.
It's a spiritual fact that science has caught up with.
Yeah, and eventually our science understands it, like the Higgs-boson, principle and all those things. So, it's just seeing that this is the case now with quantum theory. So the reason the system is old is not because it's a linear process of the 1950s. It's old in the 1950s. It's just old because it's now a disproved reality functioning, trying to solve a problem that it cannot solve because it's still functioning within an old paradigm, which is why we need something like a United Nations, 2, international humanitarian organisation, stroke, and also an international simultaneous policy organisation that has the ability to regulate globally from a wise, intelligent, compassionate, heart-based perspective. Now, that does sound ideological, and also it can sound also utopian, like something in the future. But it's not, because if you can see what's happening right now, things are happening exponentially now. Technology, communication. So it is unfolding. It's just been held back by an old structure. So that is the shift now. The shift now is when all the people who resonate with it and understand a new emergence begin to link up, connect. And we've got to sing on the same hymn sheet and say enough is enough to survive as a species.
We're out of time.
Yep.
Where can people go for more information? I know you have a website, and maybe a few others you want.
Okay. Well, mine is www.jamesparker.org.uk, and also the simple one, which is www.simple.org, and also www.onepeopleoneworld.net. So those three are significant ones, and they are all focused on unification. And the other ones, all of them, join all of them. What is really important is that they begin to collaborate and unify, and actually bring out the best in each area. So wise education, wise environmental practice, all these NGOs, the only way we can really solve it is if we begin to work together.
Great, brilliant. Well, thank you, James. I really appreciate it. It's fascinating what you have to say, and I hope people will kind of take forward what you're saying.
I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you.
We do it.
Great. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to talking to you again on Conscious 2, hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.